Well, I want to welcome Rory Stewart to the Devex World stage. Rory is someone known to, I think, everyone tuning in, but maybe in a different capacity. Some know you as an author of 4 books. Your most recent is Can Intervention Work? And probably most people in the Devex community recognize you for your role leading DFID. For some months before you ended up becoming a candidate against Boris Johnson for the prime ministership and went through lots of issues in British politics. You now find yourself as a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute at Yale University. And we are so delighted just to get a few minutes of your time, Rory, to talk about all that's going on in the UK in the world of global development, because there sure is a lot happening right now.
Well, great to be with you, Raj. Great to see you again, and it's a pleasure.
So look, what everyone is focused on at the moment, the latest sort of scandal du jour, is the idea that the British government has announced it will reduce its intention in terms of development spending from 0.7% of gross national income to 0.5%. It adds up to significant numbers, billions of pounds less in spending each year, although there is legislation that suggests that the government is committed to spending 0.7. How important is this? I mean, obviously there's the financial side of it, but how important is this in your mind?
Well, it's hugely important, Raj. And I think the thing is to get beyond the sort of legal arguments and the financial arguments. Fundamentally, this has been coming from the right wing of the Conservative Party. This is a classic populist anxiety about international development. And as soon as he's done this, Boris Johnson, as you can imagine, is getting a huge amount of applause from the right wing of the Conservative Party, from people saying, why are you wasting our tax money supporting international development? And it follows on from the merging of the Department for International Development with the Foreign Service. So when I was the Secretary of State, I was an independent cabinet minister with my own department, reporting only to the Prime Minister and with a defended 0.7%, which was, because the British economy is a very large economy, that meant that we were spending nearly $19 billion a year. And it could only be spent really on poverty, couldn't be spent on British trade, couldn't be spent in middle-income countries generally, very much focused on poverty. And all that is changing, and that has huge implications for international development, because there's a lot of money, and of course a lot of implications for partners who work with DFID.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you could suggest when you were Secretary of State, that was sort of the golden era of British global development, overseas development and cooperation. Is that era over? Are we now in a new period that we may have a hard time getting back to that point in time when you were the leader?
I think it may be difficult, because once you've broken that 0.7% commitment, once you've abolished the department, you've given a lot of red meat to people who've been demanding this for 10 or 15 years. It's very difficult, as it were, to put that horse back in the stable. So I know people are saying maybe this is only temporary and maybe next year Boris Johnson will recommit to the 0.7%. That's very unlikely. His political base is very excited by the fact that he's cut the money. They're not going to be very pleased if he restores it. So it will then be left to another government to see if they restore it. And there really the question, which is fundamental to every bilateral program in the world, is how do you regain the confidence of voters? And that's about really thinking about the fact that this is people's money and that they're spending it, they feel, in countries about which they don't know a great deal. And often we speak to voters in a very, very technocratic language, or we speak in numbers. We talk about educating 100 million girls, which, is a wonderful thing, but doesn't feel very real to people. It's not easy, very, very complicated solving this problem of how you communicate to people. But asking yourself again and again, as a civil servant, as a minister, is this how I would spend my own money? Is this how my grandmother would want to spend her money? Is central. And the second bit, I think, that's central is the question maybe we can get onto, which is the question of quality, the quality of programs on the ground, not the high-level numbers, but how good is that school? How good is that clinic?
Yeah, you've sometimes been a critic of the aid industry, as it were. You're also known, I mentioned the many ways people may know you. They may recall that you walked across the country of Afghanistan and other countries in the region and have served as an NGO leader. And so you've seen on the ground up close the way development projects work, and you've not always thought it was done right. And I wonder, do you think we're at a moment we need to kind of have a fundamental rethink of the global development project, of the international architecture, of the organizations that do this work? Because if the politics really are moving in this direction and they're hard to get back, where does that leave us when we look at a world that's this unequal and that's facing the climate crisis that's ahead of us?
Couple of observations there, Raj. First is, I think we need to put environment and climate right at the heart of what we do. When I was the Secretary of State for International Development, the first thing I did was to double the amount that DFID spent on environment and climate work. And that was tough then. I mean, that's not very long ago. That's just over a year ago, because many economists in the department thought that there was a direct choice or a tension between dealing with poverty or dealing with the environment, instead of seeing the connections between those two things. I think the second thing is, if we are to save this field, we must break out of jargon and rhetoric and universal solutions and theories and focus on the quality of delivery on the ground. So I would, I tried in DFID. I don't know whether it's an easy thing to do, but I almost want to ban words like sustainability, inclusivity, strategic, long-term, because you say those things, nobody disagrees, right? Everybody nods happily. But what nobody actually does is really think about what that means in Mali, right? So just to finish on that, instead of talking about inclusivity, get to the detail, right? If what you're saying is, why have we only included the women in the peace process in Syria, but not the Kurds? Say that. Don't use the jargon word inclusivity.
Well, and I guess so much of the reason we use jargon is this is a politically sensitive space, right? We're talking about government money and international institutions, and there's a lot of care with which people feel the need to speak. You're a former leader now. You're out of government. You have the ability, and frankly, your whole career, you've been quite outspoken. But I wonder if you feel that as we consider the challenges of our industry, of development, and this project that we're all engaged in, is it deeper than just the language? Is there more that we have to do? When you think about quality, localization is a big theme right now, and decolonizing of development, getting more funding to the local actors who maybe can do more with it.
So 100%, yes, must be about being at the front line. I think we can have an argument about whether the person at the front line always needs to be local. I mean, I can imagine a perfectly good program being run in Syria by somebody who's Lebanese or even Egyptian. They don't all have to be local. But the key is that they are operating at the most local granular level. We need to move away from a world of people sitting behind desks, moving bits of paper around, to making the real heroes of the project the person that is really delivering the good school. I mean, to take an equivalent in something that we understand in our normal lives, we sense that in the field of education within the United States or Europe, that the hero is, in the end, the school teacher, not the civil servant sitting in the Department of Education, right? I mean, maybe it's unfair because they've all got an important part to play, but that's where our emphasis is. That's where our human emphasis is. We sense that. And that's even more true in development, because the closer you get to the front line, frankly, the more uncomfortable it is. In many countries, the more dangerous it is, the more risk and sacrifice you're making being there. So keep the emphasis there. Strangely, we've created a world where too often we are giving all the plaudits and all the promotions to the people who are back in head office. And I don't know how one turns that around.
Yeah, that's a challenging one to do. And I wonder, thinking about these very principles you're bringing to us, how you grade the pandemic response when it comes to the lowest income countries. Obviously, we're still early going, but we may well see that those of us living in the United States and Europe get access to a vaccine much earlier, for example, than those living in poorer countries. How do you grade where we are today with the response?
Well, I think it's devastating. I've just got back from Afghanistan, Raj, so I was lucky enough to go there just a few weeks ago. And I'm still involved in this nonprofit in Kabul. Nearly 80% of our staff have contracted COVID. And that's not unusual across Kabul as a whole. Those are probably representative numbers across that capital city. And now a second wave is hitting villages that didn't previously have it. They haven't actually, despite these catastrophic numbers, actually achieved the kind of herd immunity that people hoped for. And this comes on top of every other problem that you can imagine. So look, you don't need me to say this. Everybody at the event is deeply and profoundly aware of this. But the numbers of deaths that you're looking at in developing countries will be well beyond the number of deaths that will be happening in the developed world.
Right, and that's of course from the pandemic itself. There's the immediate health response, but then there's all of the after effects, the economic after effects that will be with us for quite some time.
Yeah, exactly. And there are economic effects coming from 17 different directions simultaneously. It'll be the effects of the fact that it's frankly difficult for many of us to raise money in nonprofits. It's the economic effects of business and trade and the economy. We operate in Jordan, for example, where there's been a huge collapse in tourism income. That's true in a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So yes, the impacts of this are incredibly profound, particularly in economies that are open to the global world and which rely on services.
As we close, maybe we can just come back to the UK again, given your long role there in government and as a politician. We're close to the deadline for Brexit. As we've discussed, there's the merger of DFID and the Foreign Commonwealth Office. We have this reduction in the target for spending. Boris Johnson had put forward this idea of a global Britain, which now sounds a bit farcical in this scenario. How do you see this going from here? And what are your own plans? Do you think there will be a Rory Stewart candidacy in the future, or if not you, others like you who bring this internationalist, more globally engaged idea back into the political arena?
Well, I deeply hope so, because the danger is that people who talk about global Britain, and you might make the same comment about people who were talking about Make America Great Again, are doing something very paradoxical. On the one hand, they're talking as though they want to be a big international power, but basically their support base is very isolationist. So Brexit is presented as Britain going out into the world, but actually what it's doing, if you look at the cutting of the 0.7% and the fact they haven't really invested in the foreign service and they're losing their ties with Europe, is they're in danger of retreating inwards. And this is particularly dangerous for Britain, which is one of the most internationalized economies in the world, one of the most diverse populations in the world, extraordinary diaspora populations. Our business is deeply connected to business all over the world. Our culture, our art, our soft power is a global phenomenon. So Britain really has no choice other than to lean into the world. And whoever follows in politics, they have to rediscover that confidence. That's about obviously getting away from a colonial past. That's not getting into a strange world of wagging our finger and telling other people what to do. But it's about partnering with other people. And I think development aid, sensitively, thoughtfully done, is of course absolutely at the core of living out our values in a global world.
Well, this is a key issue. What happens in the UK is going to reverberate all over the world. So getting a few minutes of your time for these perspectives has been so valuable. Thank you, Rory Stewart, for being a part of Devex World.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.